He perdido la cuenta del número de veces en que alguien me ha preguntado, ¿y cómo es que hablas el español tan bien? Igual me han comentado conocidos hispanos y no hispanos, porque yo sé que no soy la persona que imaginan cuando piensan en una latina. My favorite way to reveal I speak the language, though, is by jumping into conversations happening near me. Because the other person will usually say, ¿Hablas español? Usually followed with, I hope I wasn't saying anything inappropriate. We usually assume that we know a person's background. But what I learned at a very young age is that I will never know a person's story unless I ask. I know that I'm not what most people picture when they imagine a Mexican American, and I don't fit the assumptions that some people have about the children of immigrants. According to a recent study from the Pew Research Center, more than 11 million people living in the US are undocumented immigrants. And according to the Center for Migration Studies, more than 5 million children born in the US live with an undocumented parent. And at one point, I was one of them. My mom is from Mexico. She was born and raised in the state of Colima, where my brother is also from. And I asked her about her experience crossing the US border for the first time last year and recorded our conversation. And for the first time in my life, I understood how courageous she is. And I also realized that my generation, the children of these immigrants, we will never know fear or loss as deeply as those who came before us. This story about an illegal crossing is an important part of my family's history, and it has greatly influenced my ability to stand before you today as the American daughter of a Mexican immigrant who is now developing the first bilingual Spanish language media program as a faculty member at the Reynolds School of Journalism. In 1976, my mom's brother was already living in the US, so he arranged for her to meet with a coyote, or a human smuggler, at a motel in Tijuana. Tijuana is a Mexican city bordering California, and it's a 27-hour drive from Tecomán, where my mom was living at the time. She was only 20 years old when she crossed the border illegally to live with her brother, leaving my brother, who was only 2 at the time, to live with our grandparents in Mexico. And her first attempt at crossing was not successful. As she ran across the desert, the people around her started yelling, so she threw herself into the bushes and held her breath. She could hear the tires of the Border Patrol vehicles approaching. They were all detained and sent back. But just a day or so after that experience, she was connected with a different coyote, and this time she did enter California successfully. She worked as a nanny for a year in Southern California before she moved back to Mexico. 6 years after that experience, my mom lived in Tijuana with my brother, and that's where she met my dad. And she is going to be so mortified when she realizes that I'm telling this many people how they actually met. Because growing up, she would make my sister and me say that they met through a mutual friend. Sort of. Think of it as the Mexican Match.com of the early 1980s. There was a matchmaker, a woman in Tijuana, who had a book with pictures of men and women looking for love. And as the story goes, my dad saw my mom's picture and picked her out, and he would drive more than 2 hours one way just to see her. And even though she didn't speak very much English and he didn't speak very much Spanish, this somehow worked out. They got married. My mom and my brother moved with my dad back to Long Beach, California, and she took English classes there when she was pregnant with me. She became an American citizen in 2000. Thank you. I identify as a woman of color. I straddle 2 worlds, as a white woman and as a Mexican. And what most people don't know about me is that I feel like my truest self when I can speak Spanish. So as a white woman, I have people confide in me their insecurities around diversity or immigration. They'll ask me things like, so how do I approach them without being offensive? I have well-meaning colleagues go through a roster of ethnic-sounding last names trying to pick out diverse students, only to find out that that student isn't actually Hispanic. And as a Mexican, I hear how some Latinos talk about the ignorant white person. Some share their incredible stories of their journeys into the United States with me. And I also witness the discrimination that exists both against the Latino who either doesn't speak English or against those who don't speak Spanish fluently. It is amazing to me that nearly 30 years after being hurt by some of the things people said about my mom, I still have people tell me that anytime they hear someone speaking Spanish, automatically assume they're illegal. Or that one of my students at the university was warned by her own parents that her teachers probably wouldn't expect much from her because she's Mexican. Or that one of my colleagues was overheard saying that the only reason I have the job that I have now is because I was the only Hispanic candidate. I didn't speak English until I was 5. I vividly remember being pulled out of kindergarten to count gummy bears in English. And growing up, people would often ask me if I knew Spanish so well because of my Mexican nanny. Yeah, I always wondered why they wouldn't just assume that she's my mom. It also never occurred to me that my friends' parents weren't also pulling over at the strawberry field on their way home from elementary school and running out of their cars to yell, "Ahí viene la migra! Ahí viene la migra!" The way that my mom used to do to warn the field workers that there was an immigration van around the corner. So your parents didn't do that? Everyone here today has made an assumption about someone. Someone you're meeting for the first time, and most likely someone you already know. We are really good at forming judgments of other people. We jump to conclusions based on how they look, how they sound, by their last name, whether or not they have tattoos or piercings, and certainly by the color of their skin. I'm guilty of it too. I emailed a filmmaker asking if he would consider talking to my students about the provocative content he produces. He has a Hispanic last name, and he's outspoken about being an undocumented immigrant. And I thought it would be a great fit with my bilingual project, given his Latino background. Well, I never heard from him. And then last summer, I got to attend a conference where he was one of the keynotes. And at one point, he mentioned his Filipino background. I sank into my chair because I had just committed the exact same mistake that I warned other people against, and I am still so embarrassed about that. Assumptions are limiting, and they can have a severe impact on our life. Assumptions represent fixed views, but how do they even form? Is it influenced by your identity, by your family? Maybe it's what happens to you. But you know who approaches life without bias? Children. I love watching my daughters navigate new situations because it reminds me that we aren't born with preconceived notions. When my older daughter was a toddler and had just started talking, like putting sentences together, we went to the store. And the parents in the room, you know that kids are going to say exactly what they think. So we're standing in line waiting to pay, and she says, and I swear she was shouting, "Look, Mommy, her skin is like chocolate." She's pointing to a black woman. And everyone around us, including this woman, has just heard what she said. But the thing I realized in that moment is that my daughter was just describing the person she saw. She wasn't making a racial statement, and it wasn't attached to any kind of judgment. So with what felt like all eyes on me, I took a deep breath and I said, "It does. And isn't she beautiful? Do you want to introduce yourself?" You have always held the power to challenge your assumptions. At some point in your life, that power was only momentarily taken away from you. Maybe you had a bad experience and then associated everyone in that category with it. But imagine if the next time you caught yourself making an assumption, you paused. I just counted to 5 in my head. It can feel like an eternity, especially if you're standing on stage staring into a sea of people. It's a trick I've developed over the years to help me be a better listener and gather my thoughts and communicate ideas more clearly. We are terrified of being wrong. We don't like to seem like we don't know what we're talking about. So we would rather make something up or nod along quietly instead of learning to say 3 simple words. I don't know. It can be the most liberating phrase you ever learn. Have the courage to admit what you don't know, so that the next time you're out and you hear someone speaking another language, or you're going through your roster and you're trying to pick out someone by name alone, or you meet a child that doesn't look like his or her caregiver, take a breath, challenge that assumption that just crept into your mind, and have the courage to ask. Porque esos 5 segundos podrían transformar su perspectiva y abrir la puerta a un mundo sin límites. Muchas gracias.